Again, greetings, brothers and sisters. To today, the fourth Sunday of Advent. On the four last things, today is the Sunday of heaven. On the four elements, today is the Sunday of earth. And of the four powers of the Magus, today is the Sunday of to keep silent. Now, the season of Advent itself is divided up into two parts. The first part, from the first Sunday of Advent up until the 16th of December. This is the part where we talk about the Last Judgment, looking forward to the Last Judgment, death, judgment, hell. It's very doom and gloom. You may have noticed I've struck that note consistently through the past 3 Sundays. The second part of Advent begins on the 17th of December. You may have heard of the O antiphons, which actually make up the hymn, O Come, Emmanuel. That's why we've used this hymn as the closing song for every Sunday this season. This second part is the expectation and the preparation for Christmas, the preparation for Jesus' birthday. And that's why the fourth Sunday of Advent, we disperse with the doom and gloom, and we see the Sunday of heaven. We see the Sunday of heaven. And in today's gospel, we hear John the Baptist proclaiming that all flesh will see the salvation of God. Now, today's gospel is actually pretty interesting. It's interesting in the sense that it gives us a look into mystical interpretations as given by the fathers of the church. And it's pretty interesting because mystical interpretation can also mean allegorical interpretation. At least that's how it's often been treated. Such as, in the beginning of the verse, well, I've got some notes here that I want to go through. In the beginning of the gospel reading, the fathers consistently tell us that the reason that the evangelist, in this case Luke, tells us the year and tells us not only who is the leader amongst the Jews, but who is the leader amongst the Gentiles in the region, is that while the law was given to the Jews only, so the gospel is given to all people. That's why it's important to say who is the leader of the Jews, who is the governor of Judea, who is the tetrarch of Galilee, and so on. Who are the high priests? It shows that while the law was given to one people that is selected, the gospel does not recognize a chosen people. The gospel recognizes all people equally. The gospel is given to all people equally. And the gospel is a gift to all people who accept it. This is why we have, I want to find it in my notes before I start talking. This is why we have in verse, oh, I'm on the wrong page, shame on me. In verse 4, I'm going to say C, verse 4c, make ready the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And then verse 5, every valley shall be filled, every mountain and hill be brought low. The crooked will become straight and the rough way smooth. When we see this, we have a number of the fathers commenting. St. Gregory the Great tells us, when the valley when filled increases, but the mountains and hills when brought low decrease. Because the Gentiles by faith in Christ receive fullness of grace. In other words, the Gentiles are represented by the valley. The Jews are represented by the mountain. They were the chosen people. Yet the mountain is being brought low. The Gentiles being the unchosen people. The valley is filled. What happens is, one is becoming lower, the other is becoming higher, both becoming equal. The Jews are no longer the chosen people with the coming of Jesus and the gospel. The Gentiles are no longer a reprobate people, if they ever were, because the gospel sees all as equal. This is what St. Gregory the Great is telling us. Now, Origen tells us you may understand the mountains and hills to be hostile powers, which have been overthrown by the coming of Christ. This is a different interpretation. But it's still, what we're finding is, different fathers could have different allegorical or mystical interpretations for the same text, but the interpretation is still valid. Reason being, while you have literalist schools within Christianity, The general gist was the literal interpretation was only just one amongst numerous others. There are literal interpretations, there are allegorical interpretations, there are anagogical interpretations, how one thing leads to another. Big examples in John 3, 14 and 15. As Moses raised up the brazen serpent, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. That the serpent, the bronze serpent of Moses, is a type, that is a figure, that points towards the coming of Christ. Christ on the cross specifically. So this Sunday gives us a great chance and a great exercise in how to read Scripture mystically and allegorically. In fact, I'd like to point out that word mystical, is from the Greek mystikos. In fact, in the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, it's common to find sections where the priest says things mystikos, silently, secretly. Mystic means secret. Mysticism is about attaining the secret in our hearts as it communicates with the secret communication of God. The secret communication of God in our breast. And for all the talking I've done, I think it's important that whether we speak mystically or secreta voce, as the same concept is conveyed in the Latin Mass, whether we speak secretly or mystically, it's important to understand the concept of heaven. Now, 2 weeks ago on the Sunday of Hell, I mentioned Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey and how they had the conception of your own personal hell, rather than the fire, the brimstones, the demons, and the pitchforks. And that's a concept that I really do tend to think of when I think of hell, when I think of Gehenna. I have to wonder at the same time, do we have our own personal heaven? Is there a personal heaven? Because let's face it, heaven is supposed to be ultimate unending joy and delight in the vision of God, the beatific vision. How many of us are actually going to enjoy the idea of angels with harps all the time? How many of us are going to enjoy the same 2 or 3 chords being played on those harps for trillions and trillions of years? It's like nobody understands how long eternity really is. So would it not make more sense that, and this is just speculation on my part, I am asserting nothing here doctrinally or dogmatically, it's merely speculation. Would it not make more sense that there was a personal heaven, a personal thing that is so wonderful to us? Now, in Luke, Jesus says that in heaven people are neither married nor will be married. But that doesn't mean we won't see our loved ones. It won't mean we won't see our deceased pets or our deceased children if we are unfortunate enough to see them die before we do. Or our parents or so on. It doesn't mean we won't see them. It doesn't mean we won't be around our friends that have gone before us. It doesn't mean that we may be separated from enemies who also made it into heaven. Because let's face it, there are people who have the same chance of getting in there as we do that we may not particularly like. So, the conception of a personal heaven, it's a lot more appealing to me than like a universal one-size-fits-all. Again, this is merely a theological speculation. I make no assertion here. I just want to be clear there. But there's also the question of who gets into heaven. Now, I'm getting into this because there are a few different debates on this, and it's difficult to discuss the subject without discussing salvation. I'm going to get into the occult conceptions behind it, but I need to talk about the exoteric first. Now, there's a debate over who gets into heaven. On the one hand, you have the universalists who believe everybody gets into heaven, or they at least want to hope that everybody can get into heaven. On the other extreme, I'm not sure what to call them. Narrowist, rigorist, I don't know. I'll make up a word. That only so many people will get into heaven, and everybody else is condemned to hell, or as the Jehovah's Witnesses believe, they're annihilated. There is no hell. They're just simply annihilated after they die. And most people, I think, fit somewhere in between the two extremes. Now, me personally, I don't agree with universalism. Neither do I agree with predestinationism. That from the beginning of time, God chose somebody that will be in heaven and everybody else is condemned, just so that God can glorify himself. Like a megalomaniac with the Napoleon complex. That actually comes from Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion, where he even says God set Adam up to eat from the fruit of the tree. This is how maniacal Calvin's God is. See, I have a problem with both extremes because I believe in something called free will. Now, I'm not getting into the debate between libertarian free will or compatibilist free will. One is that there's no determinism whatsoever and that your free will reigns supreme, period. The other, compatibilism, is that there's a type of determinism, but your free will may overcome it. The amount of difficulty it takes to that free will depends on the person you're talking to who's spouting the theory. But you see, universal, and God brings everybody into heaven. What about people who don't want to go to heaven? What about people who actively decide that? If free will is real, and Catholic theology teaches that man is radically free in his will, even original sin does not extinguish free will. This is found in the Council of Trent, session 6. Even the original sin does not diminish free will. If free will is a thing, and if God respects free will, which is basically what we have in the teaching that God assists in the acts of free will of his creatures, even sin. We talked about this last week. I also talked about this in a blog post where I said there is no left-hand path. When we talked about this, how can universalism be a thing? Because he is not willing that any should perish, 2 Peter 5:8, but it's up to you whether you perish. You may choose to perish. You may choose to perish. You may choose to go down that particular path. And he's going to respect your free choice to do so. So that is why I reject universalism. Because I believe in free will. I believe very strongly in free will. Now, the other extreme, double predestination, or tulip as it's called. Only so many get into heaven because God chose so. The others, no matter what they think, do, say, believe, otherwise they're going to be condemned regardless. I reject that also because of free will. Both extremes, it's like a theological horseshoe theory. They wrap around at the ends. I reject both. I'm more or less somewhere in between. Every person, okay, as Catholic theology tells us, for every person that does not have sanctifying grace, God does everything he can to help that person achieve sanctifying grace. For every person that has attained sanctifying grace, God does everything he can for these people to maintain it. So, in this conception, God does everything he can to help you because he's not willing that you should perish. But ultimately, whether you accept the gift or reject the gift is up to you. Up to you, you. Remember what I said before. Every valley is filled, every mountain is brought low. The Jews are no longer the chosen people. Well, there's no other chosen people either. Everybody is equal in this regard. What happens to their individual soul after death is dependent upon them in this life. Not just their beliefs, but the merits that they have made with their actions. This is also in Trent, session 6. The necessity of both faith and works. And for those who don't have the faith, if they want to do the right thing, if they do the best they can with what they have, they can still make it into heaven. Paul talks about this in Romans 2, verses 11 to 15. So there is no monopoly on heaven. Just as Judaism has the idea of the righteous Gentile, Catholicism has the idea of the noble pagan. Both ideas they're very similar. They're almost exactly the same. Do the best you can with what you have. Common sense, natural law. That's pretty much the most of what God requires of you. I'm going to walk that back a bit. That's pretty much the most God requires of you, contingent upon what you have heard and what you know. So with all that said, I think I've rambled on and on enough about the exoteric conception of heaven. Let's dive a bit deeper, okay? Let's dive a bit deeper into the mystical interpretations. Let's talk about the element of earth, and let's also talk about being silent. How do they tie into each other? And in future years, I'm just going to pick one theme and stick to that theme when I talk. This year, I'm just throwing a wide net because I just want to get the basics covered. Then I can develop these themes in future years as we grow together. Okay. Paracelsus tells us that heaven is the field upon which man's imagination throws its seeds. And I read an email from David Goddard right before I started today's broadcast. I didn't get a chance to read it thoroughly, but he's talking about how heaven is the field upon which man plants his seeds and visualization as a tool in this. Basically, heaven is the source from which the magician's manifestation comes. I'm trying to synthesize what I read very quickly here, because I want to read the whole thing. I'm going to do that once I finish this talk. I just didn't have time. I had to run in here and set up the technology right quick. But I think that's a good jumping point. Eliphas Levi talks about the plastic medium. Denning and Phillips talk about the astral light. And we have so many conceptions. The law of correspondence, the principle of mentalism, so many conceptions that play into this. Heaven is the field on which the seeds of man's imagination are planted. Now, this doesn't mean that God is a combination of a pal and Santa Claus. It doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that God has given man the gift to communicate with heaven, to reach up into heaven, and to manifest his will, his desire down here on earth. Now, every one of us has had at least one experience where this has happened. Whether it's through conventional prayer, whether it's through spell casting, whether it's through visualization work. Even the law of attraction has some merit in this regard. I just find that partisans of the law of attraction tend to be, how do I say this nicely? Less than fully literate when it comes to what they're talking about. I hope that was nicely enough. They tend to be less than fully literate. They don't understand everything that's going on. Yet we have the ability to reach up to heaven and to pull enough matter down. I'm just going to use the term astral substance, but the conceptions of the mental plane, the causal plane, all that, it comes into this. I'm just going to use astral substance for now as a generic term. But to pull that substance down, to form it, to mold it, and mold it on the higher plane, in which case its counterpart manifests on the physical. In fact, Hebrews chapter 9, was it 20, 21, somewhere around there, touches on this, talking about the patterns of heavenly things, the copies of heavenly things, and the heavenly things themselves. This is the law of correspondence. The heavenly things themselves are what's above. The copies of heavenly things are what's below. So we have as above, so below. We actually have this conception in the Bible. The patterns of heavenly things and the heavenly things themselves. What we have here on earth is a copy of the things of heaven. So what we manifest in heaven, what we're doing is we're creating the real thing up in the astral light so that its copy will manifest down here on the physical. That's the connection between heaven and earth. The Sunday of heaven and the Sunday of earth. The earth, on the other hand, the element which we talk about today, is basically the playground on which our manifestation happens, on which our free will plays out, and so does the free will of others. In fact, a lot of what I think are the problems, a lot of what I think people consider determinism, while I would think of that, is actually interplay in the conflict of various free wills interacting with one another. I may want the houses across the street. Actually, there is no house across the street from where I live. But I may want the house across the street for the sake of argument. You may want the house across the street for the sake of argument. Our wills have now just come into conflict because we both want the same thing. So what do we do about that? That's the drama of the planet Earth, the drama of the element of Earth, the drama of where we are right now. How those wills conflict. A lot of the evil in the world, in my opinion, it's not man's degenerate, reprobate nature. It's simply the freedom of will being used responsibly or abused irresponsibly. And some of those with that free will lording it over others who are not able to exercise their will as powerfully. This goes back to the Melian dialogue, a conflict between the Athenians and the independent isle of Melos. When the Melosians, they tried to negotiate. They kept trying to negotiate. Ultimately, the Athenians just said, We're done here. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer as they must. And then they conquered the island. This is the conflict of free will, the use and abuse of free will, the lording of will over others. That's why I like the Episcopalian Catechism in the 1979 prayer book, when it says, what is sin? Sin is a seeking of the lower will over the things of God. I'm paraphrasing, but it says the seeking of the lower will. The abuse of free will is sin. The right use of free will is the beginning of the path of righteousness. Now, it may be written that man cannot have faith without God's invitation. And that is the doctrine. Again, that is also in Trent. However, it is man's free will that accepts that invitation or rejects it. It is man's free will that creates in heaven and manifests on earth, or otherwise creates on earth and manifests in heaven. That's the law of correspondence played out in the paradigm in the paradigm that we speak, what we teach, and that we preach. It's just as valid in Christianity as it is in neo-paganism, just as valid as it is in the New Age, just as valid as it is in any other path or tradition. So, what else do we have here? Earth is the testing ground. It's the arena. Heaven is the field on which imagination is planted. What else do we have? But within ourselves to arrange the meeting of the two. And this is where we come to the fourth key of the magician, to be silent. What is to be silent? Within mysticism, silence is important to us. Within magic, silence is considered important. Gareth Knight tells us in his Practical Guide to Kabbalistic Symbolism that silence is necessary to maintain the psychic stresses of a work that is being done. And that if silence is broken, then the stresses are lost and it doesn't manifest on the physical plane. This is the conception of Sephora Binah as the dark, sterile mother, she who restricts. Just as the womb, as a woman's womb, where the sperm meets the egg, the child is conceived, the child is limited while it may develop and grow until it can live outside the womb and then is passed into the world, the bright, fertile mother. Silence is our place as the dark, sterile mother, magically speaking. Mystically speaking, silence is even more powerful. Silence gives us a way to be away from distractions. The distractions of other people talking to us, the distractions of ourselves talking to other people, the distractions of an electronic device in front of us, the distractions of the internet, the distractions of video games, the distractions of television, the distractions of corporate advertising. And it gives us a chance to be inside of ourselves, to confront our own thoughts, to learn who we truly are. And the truth is, every magical tradition stresses this. Until we learn who we truly are, we're pretty much crap as magicians. Because until we learn who we truly are, we don't know the methods of manifestation that work for us. We don't know our relation with deity or with the spirits or even with our own mind. Until we know who we truly are, we don't get to become badass. Think of it this way. Everybody wants to be a badass like Batman. But nobody wants to be Bruce Wayne when he got older. Because Bruce Wayne never worked out who he really is. His mind never got past what happened in that alley. He became the badass to overcompensate for what happened in that alley. But when he got old, he was bitter. He was lonely. He was everything you don't want an old man to be. He was pathetic. That's why we learn who we are. This is why we retreat into the silence of ourselves. And how do we do this? You can get up an hour early in the morning, like when you do your daily practice. You can get up an hour early, or you could stay up like an hour or so after everybody else in the house goes to sleep. Or just arrange some time to yourself when you won't be bothered and there's no or very little noise around. Be it the neighbor's stereo or cars going down the street or whatever. And what you do is you sit there. You sit there for about 20 minutes alone with yourself, alone with your thoughts. This isn't meditation, this is contemplation. Alone with your thoughts. Work through your thoughts. Work through clearing your thoughts. And sometimes what goes on inside of our head could be frightening. What goes on inside our head can be frightening. We don't want to confront things that happened to us in our childhoods. We may not want to confront things that happened to us in past relationships. We may not want to confront our feelings about the things that happened to us yesterday. But facing and working through those feelings is how we get to the root of who we are. As human beings, as manifestors, as magicians, as spiritual workers, as Christians, as pagans, as Hindus, as Buddhists, as whatever the hell we are. And it begins with silence. There is an anonymous document, I think it was written by a Carthusian monk. It was found in his cell after he died, called The Ladder of Silence, the Golden Ladder of Silence. And he speaks of silence as having 12 rungs. It starts with just not talking. It starts with not talking. Goes on to not moving. And eventually, the silence is where you find that communion with God. God is met in the silence, the still small voice. And it basically begins by sitting down and shutting up just for 20 minutes. Delving into the depths within yourself. Because it's within ourselves that we meet God. The kingdom of God is within you, in the Gospel of Luke. Now the word in the Greek is endos. Now this could mean within, among, in your midst. It could mean the kingdom of God is within you, the individual, or the kingdom of God is in the midst of you, the community. I say both. For where 2 and 3 of you are gathered together, I am in the midst of you. Or if you cultivate what is within you, it will save you. If you do not cultivate it, it will destroy you. Right there. Both. The kingdom is both. The gift is both, in the person and in the community. This is why the whole conception for love of deity, love of self, and love of neighbor are the first 3 keys of successful, effective prayer. And why silence is the first key to go inside of yourself. Ever notice how many traditions tell you meditation? The Golden Dawn has you meditating upon a dot for 15 minutes on the first meditation. The current Martinist pre-initiate curriculum has something called the point meditation. The idea is the silence and the stilling of the mind. And from this silence, we have the stresses that we build up in our work. And our work has therefore become manifest. If not swiftly, then definitely mightily. Because we have journeyed to the center of ourselves. We have found that which is within the center of ourselves. And we have developed that which is within the center of ourselves. We have brought it forth into the world. And that which we grab from the astral light becomes that which we create on the earth below. There are still rules about how we do this. The sphere of availability being the biggest one. Nobody wants to talk about that. Everybody wants to ignore it. But it's very real. There are limitations to what we can do. We are not God omnipotent. However, we shall become, as it were, gods, as the Catechism of Trent tells us. And we do have limited powers of creation. The whole of magic, Christian, pagan, or otherwise, is the engagement in our limited powers of creation. The limited powers of creation, that are given to us as a result of having a free will and the result of having a divine spark within us. That spark, which is not to say we are gods now, but it is to say that I create this book, there is a piece of me in this book. I don't have anything within reach that I created. But no, I don't have anything within reach I created, so there goes that idea. But if I create something, there's a piece of me in it. God creates something, there's a piece of God in it. God creates us, there's a piece of Him in us. There's an imprint of Him in us. And that's what I'm talking about when I mentioned that divine spark. And that's the communion we seek to develop. Because it's through that spark that we develop communion with God in us. It is through that communion that we develop our abilities in the external form, i.e. the world outside of us. It is through that communion that we develop our abilities to speak with the angels and the spirits, for those of you following the spirit model. And it's through that communion that we not only manifest here on earth, but that we shall also reign forever in heaven. Hence, our magical processes are intrinsically linked with our salvation. They're a part of the economy of salvation. Because the more we manifest God's power here, the more our faith becomes strengthened. The more our faith becomes strengthened, the more powerfully we manifest as we go forward. And so on, and so on, and so on. That right there is the secret of the fourth Sunday of Advent. Every valley will be filled. Every mountain and hill will be brought low. The crooked will become straight. The rough way smooth. All flesh will see the salvation of God. Whether we receive it is not what's being said here, only that we will see it. Whether we receive it is up to us.